I don't watch TV at all often. I don't own one. I don't subscribe to TV. I don't really know many people that have one, and I actively actually try to avoid it. And so when I do, it's always kind of surprising to me. It kind of startles me just what it's like. Because I have memories from a child watching TV a lot, but when I now go back to it, it's pretty intense what's on there. I the other day was at someone's house that had Judge Judy on, and I was kind of struck by it, and it got me thinking about TV in general, and particularly about reality TV. Now, reality TV is a broad concept, and I'm not really here talking about the things like the live action role playing game shows like Survivor or The Bachelor or whatever else. I'm more speaking about a specific genre that Judge Judy falls into. The kind where you're getting little slices of regular people's lives, or at least kind of regular people, and making judgments about them, whether it be a figure that's making judgments or it's left to the viewer with an implied prescription about that judgment for them to make their own judgments. So included in this category would be like, yeah, Judge Judy, but also like Dr. Phil or Cops or any of the shows kind of like that. And those are the three that I want to focus on here because they're the ones that I'm most familiar with. Keep in mind, though, that I have very limited firsthand knowledge. I've never actually seen a full episode of any of these shows all the way through. I'm mostly just working on secondhand knowledge and what I've gleaned from clips on the internet. So that being said, these shows correspond to certain aspects of our social interactions. And I want to view them in terms of the social function of these shows. Judge Judy represents the view of how we mediate disputes, how we deal with justice, how we deal with fairness when it comes to interpersonal dealings. Cops, on the other hand, is how we deal with deviants, how we manage deviant people, deviant behavior, and how we enforce a sense of normalcy, a sense of obedience to the status quo. Dr. Phil is kind of in that same genre where it's dealing with deviancy on an individual level, on a psychological level, and imposing prescriptions to that individual about how to change themselves to better match their social situation. Guess I gotta close the window because there's a saw out there now. In order to understand the social function of these shows, we kind of need to understand some aspects of human sociality. The way that we interact, the way that we form societies, the way that we form social bonds with one another and communities. From an evolutionary perspective, it is our ability to form communities that has given humanity its shot at success in this world. We, as individuals isolated without a community, are basically helpless. We're not very strong, we're not very fast, we're not very able to do anything at all, really. We've got our intelligence, but without the tools, without the teamwork necessary to be able to implement that intelligence, we're kind of useless. So what really gives us the advantage is that we're able to communicate with one another. We're able to form social bonds, not just with other individuals, but with family groups, with shared communities, villages, and eventually cultural groups, and now this global society that we're allegedly part of. So important is socialization in our minds that our brain actually has specialized structures that deal with socialization. We have specialized structures for like seeing faces, recognizing facial expressions, recognizing body language and tonality and whatnot. That gives us a sense of what the other, the generalized other, is thinking and feeling and the way that they're judging. And that judgment is very important because our belonging in a community means survival. If we're rejected by our communities, if we're exiled to the wilderness, we will die. So our acceptance into a community of some sort is extremely important to our evolutionary sense of success as an individual. As an illustrative thought example, imagine some villager on the plains of Africa in the pre-agricultural phase of humanity. If they happen to be rejected by their tribe, whether because they've done something wrong or because they're just generally useless or whatever else, they're basically consigned to death. The next predator that comes along, they won't have any protection from other than what defense they themselves can manage. And the surplus resources that a village can provide will allow one to have a higher standard of living. Whether or not they're actually able to fulfill all of their own needs is not so important as having a community that can fulfill all of their own needs. There's a house finch being bullied by a bunch of grackles over there. I don't quite know what's up with that. Anyway, the modes of social control that would keep people in line have changed over the generations. First, it would be the explicit threat of being exiled that would keep people in line, or some other form of martial punishment, whether it be beatings or whatever else. But as time has gone on, these methods of social control have gotten more advanced. I've talked a bit about this in previous videos, but as a brief summary, the next phase beyond that was the mystification of these social processes, so that instead of it just being the threat of an individual sovereign, a powerful person that's keeping people in line, it's this idea that God wills this idea that the natural order of the universe is behaving and conforming in this way. So, well, you got to do what God tells you and all that. After that, it started becoming more a matter of disciplinary thought, and Michel Foucault is a big thinker in this, where by tightly regimenting the norms of the way that we think and operate and behave, and by implying surveillance of our activities, the individual ends up with this disciplinary function in themselves, so that they don't have to be overtly threatened. They don't have to be overtly controlled by an outside force, because the policeman, in other words, is inside their own head. And this works for a certain level of informational awareness. But as we entered the mass age, the global age, and mass media, it's much more difficult to constrain one's social, intellectual, sensory environment. And so it's impossible to complete this illusion of this disciplinary environment. So there had to be new techniques in order to elicit the social control that was needed by those in power. Now, of course, the old techniques, whether they be the martial power or the mystical power or the disciplinary power, these are still in use, obviously. These techniques never really got old, but they've been augmented over time by these new forms of social control. What Deleuze calls the control society is where we're at roundabout now. And in this model, there is choice among the people. Everyone has complete freedom, effectively, but these choices are being made from within tight boundaries, within borders that are not rigid and at times invisible. To think that one has completely free action, to think that one is able to basically choose any form of life, any decisions, but these actual choices are quite tightly constrained. You don't really have the choice to do anything you want. You don't have free agency. You can't will anything. You only just have choice from within these limited scope of options. And this is where these reality TV shows come in. One of the primary mechanisms of ensuring these norms is one's sense of guilt and shame. There's a difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is that you've done something wrong. You've committed a crime, or you've done something to harm the community for which you should feel guilty. This guilt is implied upon you. Versus shame, which is that you are wrong. You are bad. You as an individual are fundamentally flawed in some way, and as such are subject to social censure. Both of these are, sometimes they're interchangeable. Sometimes they are used interchangeably, and this can be a bit of a danger, which I'll get into a bit later. And the function of these shows, the Dr. Phil, the Judge Judy, the cops, is implying a sense of vicarious guilt and vicarious shame on the viewer, such that they're shown this contrary role model to the form of conformity that is required of you in the society, and providing a demonstration to the viewer of this individual's failure to match up to that. It's effectively a new form of public floggings, public executions, basically making an example of people in order to not scare the populace into conformity in the former case, but rather to generate this narrowed scope of free choice that people have, such that they believe that themselves are completely free, but they're not. There's also an implicit imposition of ideology in these shows as well. In the case of Cops, it's about respecting the cops' authority, about being willing to comply with the police and viewing all criminals as bad people. And in the case of Cops, it produces this sense in the viewer that the people that are being arrested, the people that are having interactions with cops are criminals. They're not suspects. They're not being afforded a sense of innocence until proven guilty. They are criminals. They are given the label of criminal, despite the fact that there is no actual designation officially of being a criminal. This also positions the police as being the good guys, the imposers of order to protect the regular citizenry, of which the viewer of this show is implied to be, from these awful, nasty criminals and their abhorrent behavior. By curtailing their deviance and by positioning that deviance as an inherently shameful thing, then the viewer is implicitly brought into A, obedience with the authority figure of the police, and B, don't be like these people. Do the opposite behaviors of these people because they are bad. They are criminals. Judge Judy similarly implies these norms on a legal basis. She, of course, has a very narrowly constrained number types of cases that she will take, because she's obviously not going to try a murder conviction. She's not going to do domestic violence things on TV, because it's not good for ratings. It's not going to elicit the kind of lighthearted, brainless enjoyment of this spectacle. What she's really looking for is interpersonal disputes, whether it be unpaid rent in the case of the one that I saw 20 seconds of the other day, or some domestic dispute that doesn't involve necessarily violence or coercion, but more it's just a spat between individuals with basically societally inconsequential results, but with an implied normification that this is not the way that one behaves if one is a good person. The persona of Judge Judy as well is this authoritative, highly opinionated firebrand of a person who is handing out these moral judgments without any restraint. And that is the large part of her appeal. The reason why people watch Judge Judy as a reality TV show is that they admire the character of Judge Judy as this incredibly powerful judgmental force. They themselves integrate and internalize this judgment that Judge Judy is portraying here, and they see themselves as viewers as the judge is. And Dr. Phil is much the same, where he is implying upon these people that there is a societally accepted social norm, psychological norm, and he's judging people with spectacular cases, like very theatrical neuroses that they consent to be on television. They consent to be publicly berated by Judge Judy or Dr. Phil in this spectacular fashion. And so it predisposes the people that go on this show to a certain type of behavior, certain type of exhibitionist style shame. They, in large part, get off on this kind of thing. They're going on this show in order to receive the shame of the general public, because they're deriving some sense of pleasure from that, which is a whole other ball of wax. Dr. Phil and Judge Judy represent the internal judgment of the viewer, not just imposing that judgment upon them, but giving the viewer a sense of power, a sense of rightness, a sense that they themselves are worthy judges of behavior, which, unfortunately, then they carry out into the real world. Oh good, it's leaf blower time. It should be noted that it's currently raining. He's leaf blowing in the rain, tiny little particles that are wet, that are sticking to the pavement. It's just so weird. Anyway, It'd be useful then to examine what this norm is. What is this normal way of behaving that's being produced here? Well, it's obviously quite compatible with that of the status quo of capitalism as it exists. Are you working? Are you being productive? Are you being fair in your economic dealings? Are you paying your rent, etc., etc.? And that's pretty well across the board what these shows are depicting. They're a form of social control that produces in the viewer. Good is defined as behaving as a normal capitalist citizen, whereas bad is deviance from that norm. The people who go on Dr. Phil that are unemployed get particularly harsh treatment. They end up being called names and psychoanalyzed to the point where you're just lazy. You're just not performing to the standards of our society. And the same thing with Judge Judy, where she's judging people, specifically people who are impoverished, as harshly as possible in order that they are shamed out of their poverty, which obviously does not work, but produces in the viewer this fear that they themselves will be experiencing shame if they fall into this situation of perceived irresponsibility and being unable or unwilling to contribute to society, so to speak. In the case of cops, it's ramped up even more so. The more impoverished the people, the more apparently deviant the behavior, and therefore the worse the judgment in the framing of the show is. You certainly don't want to be facing the fear that you would turn out like this person who is not wearing a shirt and currently in handcuffs and speaking inarticulately and being berated by some big powerful dude with a badge and a gun and a sense of self-importance the size of the moon. The really scary part about this is that it's so insidious. I know people who watch these shows on a regular basis, and they're good people, like they're decent folks. They have empathy. They are able to see that not all people are in the same situation. Not everybody has the same advantages. They understand socioeconomic privilege and everything. But it implies in the back of their minds this judgment, this normified judgment that comes from the judgment of Judge Judy or Dr. Phil or whatever else, that colors their worldview in such a way that this empathy, this understanding of socioeconomic forces and intersectionality of race and gender and whatnot is overridden by this normified unitary judgment. And it's not necessarily even the judgment of the judge, Judy, or Dr. Phil, but it is their own internalized version of this judgment, which then gives them license and authority because they themselves are identified with the judge of Judy or of the Dr. Phil as being able to pass objective, truthful judgment against this person or phenomenon. And unfortunately, as soon as one thinks one is being objective, one is being the most subjective. One disregards any and all alternative meanings because my judgment is correct. If my aesthetic norms don't correspond to what I'm seeing, if my judgment of what is just, what is regular, what is normal doesn't correspond to how this person is behaving, they're in the wrong. There's nothing wrong with me because I am the judge. I am the jury. So you better conform. Like seriously, he's just waving the leaf blower back and forth on these wet pieces of grass and they're not moving. And what are you doing? If he used a broom, he'd be done by now. This, in its essence, is how social control works in the mass age. By creating this spectacle, a spectacle that draws the attention, draws the eye, one that is entraining and entrancing to one's attention, the boundaries that protects one's worldview, that ensures that one's aesthetic sense of the world maintains its consistency, can be bypassed. They're not addressing your reasoning here. They're not trying to provide a logical explanation or a logical justification for these norms. They're cutting through this using the moxie of Judge Judy or the smugness, the confidence of Dr. Phil in order to elicit in your primal, prehistoric, civilizational mind this notion that this is a leader, this is a trusted person that you can mimic the judgment of and gain acceptance of your tribe. Basically what this is sorcery. They're creating a worldview that is not objective, but seems objective due to the confidence with which it is portrayed. And the emotional content, this sense of shame, the sense of guilt that's implied by use of this, invokes all of those senses that allows the worldview of people viewing it to be manipulated. And so you turn people with this sense of empathy, a sense of general acceptance of the other, into judgmental jerks, even if it's on an implied level. Now, it may seem ironic that I'm making a judgment about these judgmental shows, but I have no judgment if you enjoy this kind of stuff. If this is your guilty pleasure, like, go for it. I'm not stopping you from it. But do keep in mind what this is doing to you. Keep in mind that this is trying to manipulate you, trying to basically brainwash your view of the world in such a way as to conform to the norms of the status quo. If we are to change this world away from the status quo, such that there are not marginalized people that are being taken advantage of and placed in this spectacle and etc., then we need to change these norms on an individual level. We ourselves need to stop being so judgmental of those who are marginalized and start accepting them as being people in situations. And the situation that they're in has created this power imbalance that you're now viewing in the context of judgment or psychoanalysis or the control of deviance. In other words, what we need is more empathy. We need more understanding of the positions of others and less emulation of this highly judgmental, unidimensional view of the world. Like, for example, I understand my neighbor who's still leaf blowing 20 minutes later. I understand that he loves his aesthetic cleanliness. I get that he wants perfectly flat, perfectly clear, sterile view of the world, but he's also had his judgment clouded. He's had this norm created in his mind that this is the only aesthetically acceptable way to operate. And anything that impedes that, anything that steps on his perfectly clean concrete castle, is wrong, is bad, and must be eliminated. There's kind of a theme emerging here. Anyway, I make videos whenever I make videos, and so if you enjoy this content, like, share, subscribe, all that algorithmic stuff, and maybe check out one of these videos because they're probably kind of interesting too. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you later.